Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, wise men. All right, and citizens of Westport, or guests. Pleased to have everybody here tonight. Also would like to thank Attorney General for coming, Mr. Tong. And so I think we're going to have a number of interesting topics to talk about. Just 2 seconds on the wise men. If any of you guys are retired and you don't belong to the wise men, well, you should. We have a 450-person organization of all sorts of interesting men with backgrounds, and we got the 30-plus activities that we do, and you'll never be bored if you join us, and it'll be wonderful. So we have membership information back there. Ron Holtz, our membership chair. We're starting our program year right now, and every week we meet at the Saugatuck Church down in the back, and we have interesting speakers also, in addition to what we do here with the library. So I'm going to have Mr. Marpy, your former first selectman, come up tonight. He's going to introduce Mr. Tong.
Thank you, Dewey, and good evening, wise men. It's an honor to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, Attorney General William Tong, a Connecticut native with a great family story that I think a lot of the wise men can relate to. Immigrant parents and working side by side with them in the family restaurant in Hartford. William went on to graduate from the University of Chicago Law School, practiced law at one of the great world-class law firms, Simpson & Thacher, served the Stanford community for 12 years as one of their representatives in the Connecticut General Assembly, co-chairing the Judiciary and the banking committees, and was elected Attorney General of the state of Connecticut in November of 2018, and he took office in the following January. You know, we've been hearing a lot lately about the role of attorneys general in the recent months, mainly at the national level, and with regard to witch hunts and who they are really working for. But I know William will be talking about other important initiatives he has taken that affect the everyday lives of Connecticut residents. For example, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Notwithstanding the recent local concerns in Westport about car thefts, as first selectman, I could see that a significant number of the crimes that our police department dealt with on a regular basis were directly because of or related to or had the root cause in domestic violence. One of the important pieces of legislation that then Representative Tong led to enactment was the Domestic Violence Restraining Order Act, an important weapon in the battle against domestic violence, an issue which I'm sure continues to hold his attention. As Attorney General, he's been extremely active in the areas of consumer protection and environmental protection. About 3 years ago, we found ourselves testifying together before the Connecticut Public Utility Regulatory Authority, say that 3 times, regarding Eversource's and other utilities' terrible response to Storm Isaias. That's probably, we've all forgotten that, right? But it was in August of 2020 and left most of Westport without power, internet, or wireless communication for over a week during the worst of COVID. I'm pleased to say that this resulted in stronger standards and penalties for public utility disaster response. Attorney General Tong has become nationally known for leading the fight against opioid addiction and the crisis that's created around that, and created by the opioid pharmaceutical companies, most notably Connecticut's own Purdue Pharma and its principal shareholders, the Sackler family, as well as their outside consultants. If you have any doubts about the importance of this effort, I encourage you to watch the current Netflix series, Painkiller. There's much to hear about, but in the Great Wise Men tradition, we'll also have some time for questions at the end of the Attorney General's presentation. So please welcome to the Wise Men and to the Westport Library stage, the 25th Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, William Tong.
Thank you, Jim. If it's okay with you, I thought I might come down in front. Is that all right? You just seem a little far away from me. Let me first thank Jim. Let me first thank Dewey and Doug for inviting me here tonight, for giving me a very long list of issues to address this evening. It's great to be with the Wise Men. I want to know who came up with that really creative name, but it's great. And what a wonderful place to be for this conversation and this discussion. I've been here before, but it'd be hard-pressed to find a library with a better facility than this anywhere. Let me thank Jim. I miss Jim. Jim was a great partner when I was in the legislature and a great partner during my time as Attorney General, and a very good friend. And let me say that we're of different political parties, but I don't think that, not only was it never an issue, that was never present in our conversations. We were just working together to solve a problem and collaborate, and that's a real credit to him and the way that he conducted himself as First Selectman. So thank you, Jim. So I asked Jim if he misses his old job, and I won't tell you what he said, but I get asked a similar question, and people often say, how are you doing? Don't you just love your job? And the honest answer is, well, no, because it's my job. It's not like I go to the beach or fly fish every day for a living. But I suspect we have a few lawyers in the room. I see my friend David Manis back there, who's a recovering lawyer. For the lawyers in the room, the best thing I can say is that I can't think of 5 lawyer jobs in the world that I would rather have than being a state attorney general. It is not only a tremendous honor, it is also an incredible platform to do things for the people of your state and to protect and defend Connecticut families, and really take on some of the most powerful interests on earth to clear the way for all of us to be able to do what we need to do every day, which is provide for our families, run a business, keep our jobs, pay the mortgage, put food on the table. And it feels like, yes, uphold the Constitution, and it feels like we're under constant pressure. We're all getting squeezed in so many different ways. And I see it as my role to push back on that squeeze and to give us some room and some breathing room and some space. So why are attorneys general so prominent today, and why should anybody care what we think? Well, let me give you law school in 60 seconds. People sometimes forget that, yes, we are a nation, but we are, by structure and design and by our Constitution, we are a federation of 50 sovereign states, plus territories in the district. And we have never not been a federation, bound together by our consent. We fought a civil war over that, by the way. And so we have always retained our sovereignty. And so remember civics, or if you went to law school, we, the state of Connecticut, and our 49 sister states delegated limited powers to the federal government to act on our collective behalf. But we, at all times, retained our sovereignty, right? Connecticut retained its right to decide what it was going to do on the issues in our domain, which is almost everything, unless we delegated a power to the federal government. And I think over time, the federal government became bigger and more powerful and did a lot of things on behalf of the states, which felt right when the federal government functioned, right? But as Congress became increasingly broken and unable to discharge its basic responsibilities, like passing a budget, right? That's what we're going through right now. There's no budget. There's a CR, a continuing resolution, which is a continuation of a budget passed who knows when, okay, to maintain the government at its current levels. But because Congress is so broken, what we need them to do, the fights we need them to take on have devolved back to the states. And that that phenomenon began more than 20 years ago under Attorney General Blumenthal, when the states got together, Democrats and Republicans said, big tobacco is killing Americans, and they're targeting young people to get them hooked on smoking, and we have to take them on. And they did. And that was the largest ever multi-state coordinated lawsuit in history. It produced the largest ever multi-state cash settlement in history. Believe it or not, Connecticut receives $120 million a year from big tobacco. Still, 20 years in, we've received more than almost $3 billion from the tobacco companies. And remember, that's just Connecticut. There are 45 other states that participated in that settlement, and the ones that didn't, there are a variety of reasons. But the 45 others get payments, and New York does not get the same amount as Connecticut and California and Texas. Their payments are so much bigger, which should tell you want to talk about powerful interests? Okay, they agreed to this deal in perpetuity 20 years ago to make these payments, okay? Fast forward 20 years hence, we've cut smoking in half in this country, 50%. When I was a kid, and many of you could smoke in an airplane, a restaurant, anywhere, right? Half of the smokers that we had a generation ago, they can still make the payments and make money. And so that gives you a sense of, you want to talk about powerful interests and how big they are? This gives you a sense of how big they were and now how big they still are, even in this day and age. So I've been asked to address a few issues. I'm gonna try to move quickly so that I can get to your questions. I'm gonna talk about some local stuff that's in my purview, and then I'm gonna talk about some of the national things. And then the challenge is, I could talk about any of these issues all night, and you could ask questions about them all night. And so it's hard for me to contain it to short segments, but I'll try to do that. So first of all, when I go in the morning, my job is to be the state's lawyer. And so I represent the state of Connecticut in all matters, all legal matters in which the state is a party. So if we're sued or we're suing somebody, that's my job. Or in which the state has an interest. If you think about that, that's everything. And so my job is to provide legal advice to everybody in state government, the governor, legislators of both parties. Remember, Dick Blumenthal never had, in his 20 years as Attorney General, never had a Democratic governor. So he was always Attorney General to a Republican governor. And so you've got to make it work, even if you're not of the same political persuasion. So I represent all state agencies. I represent the Department of Corrections, the Department of Children and Families. Some of the most gut-wrenching work that we do as a state is in those two areas. But that's my day-to-day job, and that's 80% of what we do in the office. And that doesn't make the paper. What can make the paper is another big part of my job, which is my Consumer Protection Authority. And so there's a law known as the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act. It is known as a UDAP law. Every state has one. Why are they called UDAP laws? Because they're unfair and deceptive acts and practices laws. Okay, I'm gonna nerd out a little bit because it's the wise men, so I'm gonna get a little technical. But a UDAP law is the basic consumer protection law in every state. And basically what it says is, you can't lie to people when you sell goods and services, right? You can't deceive them, you can't commit fraud. And so I exercise the state's authority under the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act. And that's the basic foundation of our state's Consumer Protection Authority. So I exercise that every single day in a variety of different ways. Products liability, travel, when people buy solar panels and get defrauded, all manner of things, cars. One of the big ones, though, is when I use that authority to protect people and residents against powerful forces in state that take advantage of them. So one of the most high profile and recent examples is the case of Stone Academy. So I'm gonna try to do this quick, but here's the setup. In short, we have a nationwide shortage of nurses, right? Everybody understands that. It's been true for a long time. On top of that, we have limited institutions that provide nursing education. And we're coming out of, hopefully for good, a global pandemic where nurses were extraordinarily important. Many nurses got sick, many nurses died, many nurses left the profession altogether because it was too much. And you know, from a certain perspective, who can blame them, right? And the healthcare system, I don't have to tell you, is very challenged. So in Connecticut and in many other places, there are for-profit schools that train nurses. And one of them is Stone Academy, and it is an institution that's more than 100 years old, that is a for-profit institution. And the students it tends to attract are women, and mostly women from urban communities, women of color. Why? Because this is their best option if they want to become nurses to get an education and improve their lives. These are programs that you know, they don't have to worry too much about you know, trying to get into a school like UConn or you know, Wesleyan or Yale. It's, you know, this is a professional training operation, right? And so they just have to make an application and qualify for whatever the standards are and pay the money. And so you're getting a lot of women who probably otherwise have jobs and otherwise have families. Many of them are single women, and they're just trying to make it better for themselves and their children. At $35,000 a clip, okay? And though there are loans, I mean, they're on the hook for these loans, and there's a significant cash outlay as well. So nursing schools are regulated by the federal government and state government, and there's an office called the Office of Higher Education. The Office of Higher Education is a regulator of professional schools, not just nursing schools, but cosmetology schools, and any other professional schools that require a license or certification. So they don't run nursing schools. Their job is to just make sure they comply with the law, right? And what ultimately became clear is that Stone Academy was not meeting its commitments to its students. They were not training students effectively and adequately to sit for the professional exam, which is known as the NCLEX, N-C-L-E-X. And in order to sit for the NCLEX and to get your license, you need to do your book learning, right? Your in-class education in order to pass that written test, but you also have to fulfill a bunch of clinical hours, more than 750 clinical hours, in order to be certified as a nurse here in Connecticut. Basically, Stone Academy got all these women to sign up, took their money, took federal student loan money, and didn't deliver. Okay, and at certain points they would do things, you know, they didn't keep attendance records, for example, of clinical hours. So you have no way of knowing if anybody actually did the hour of clinical training that they were supposed to do, right? Like how to take blood, right? Or how to take vital signs. By the way, does everybody want their nurse, you know, that they see to be capable and qualified to do this? Of course, it's a matter of life and death, right? And so it's really important that our nurses are properly trained and qualified. So they didn't deliver on that. And on top of that, they came up with other Band-Aids, like they would have during COVID, they would have some of their students just use the temperature gun, at the entrance of the school, and they would count if you stood there with a temperature gun zapping people as a clinical hour. Like, come on. So ultimately, it all came to a head, and the state, through its state regulator, and the federal government said, you have to shape up. And you're failing to educate your students, you're failing to certify them, prepare them for the test. Your students are failing the test at a much higher rate than they're supposed to. They're supposed to pass 80% of their students. They were, in many cases, down at 45% or lower. So the regulators showed up and said, you gotta get your act together. And essentially what Stone did was it shut down. It just closed its doors and left all these people stranded, and then tried to blame the state for it. So the way I explain it is, it's as if somebody's driving 100 miles an hour in the Merit, right? The trooper pulls out behind them to pull them over. They're driving so recklessly, they crash their car, and then they blame the trooper, right? So that's what happened here. And essentially, they went on this public relations campaign to blame us, the state and the federal regulators, who were just trying to get them to comply with the law. And finally, they weren't stepping up to meet their obligations. They weren't either paying money to reimburse students that they had essentially screwed over, right? Or finding a way to educate these students and make good on that promise. So I sued them under the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act. And in doing so, I discovered that in this for-profit institution, the main guy, Joe Beerbaum, okay, who's related to a guy, Mark Scheinberg, who runs Goodwin University and has now taken over the University of Bridgeport, that Joe Beerbaum has a $1.8 million mansion in Rocky Hill, Connecticut. Love Rocky Hill. 1.8 million in Rocky Hill is quite a house, okay? And that he was taking money out of Stone to support another institution, Payer College of Art, which is another for-profit school that they run here in Connecticut. And basically it was sort of a shell game Ponzi scheme to make money off the backs of these women, who were just trying to do better for themselves and their families. So bottom line is, we've gone into court, we've sued them, we're seeking to attach his house and all of their assets, and we're trying to get money back to the students. The state is trying to put money into helping these students continue their education. But the hard truth is, you got a lot of students who have gotten to the end of their education and they're not ready for the exam. And it's not clear how much we can do to get them ready for the exam, right? There's a lot of students who, are in the beginning or the first half of their education, and they just have to start over again. And as a regulator charged with public health, you can't look the other way. There were arguments by people who are advocating for the students who are saying, you just need to make it right and basically look the other way. Well, I can't do that. They're nurses. I can't just say, you're good, sorry what happened to you, but you can go to Stanford Hospital and practice. No, of course I can't do that. So that's an example of how we exercise our state's consumer protection authority. Let me move quickly. I'll talk about opioids for a minute. Well, I'll talk about opioids for a few minutes, but I could talk all night about opioids. And then I'll talk about Amazon quickly, and then I'll open up to questions. So if there's any one issue that I spend most of my personal lawyer time on, it's the opioid and addiction crisis. Why? Because it's the worst public health crisis in America, COVID notwithstanding. There's nobody in this room who has not been touched by this, either directly in your family, you've lost somebody, or somebody's struggling every single day with their addiction and their recovery, or a neighbor, someone down the street. It's extraordinarily difficult for the state. We lose roughly 1,500 people a year to the crisis. That's 1,500 families that have been wrecked by this crisis. And we suffer more than $10 billion a year in damage to the state. And for me, it was Mike Taylor. He was a volunteer in my first campaign in 2006. He was a high school kid in Darien at that time. Great kid, I don't have to tell you, lived in Darien, great family, all the resources in the world, and had an amazing outlook on life, was a tennis player. Went to Villanova, got injured, got the now notorious bottle of way too many pills, okay? And got addicted, came home, and this story is why this is so important. Got into recovery, fell out of recovery, got back into recovery, right? And because it's a struggle. There's no cure. And it's not just about getting people into recovery, it's about keeping them in recovery. And his family went through this cycle, and one day he was doing okay, and we lost him to a place in Norwalk, and he's gone. And so many people know this story and this pain. So when I became Attorney General, we had not collected any money from any company in the opioid and addiction crisis. We sued Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it was George Jepson who said, my predecessor, George said, you know, it's not just the manufacturers. It's not just Purdue. There's a whole industry that makes money off of people and their misery, okay? And we have to look at the distributors. 3 of the biggest companies on earth, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal, and McKesson. If you don't know them because they're not household names, just pay attention on 95 or 84, one of these days, you'll see a McKesson truck zoom by you. Why? Because they're delivering drugs real time to CVS and Walgreens. And this is our just-in-time medicine pharmaceutical system in this country. You get a prescription at 10 a.m., it's filled by 3 p.m., right? Because of these companies. They move all the pills in this country, except they were totally asleep at the switch when the opioid crisis was in full bloom, right, and exploded. And they're the ones that moved all of those pills to pill mills and to communities, including in Connecticut, where records show that those communities consumed 10 times, 20 times, 30 times more oxy than they could ever possibly consume, right, under normal circumstances. So we went after the distributors, and in September of 2019, I was 9 months into being Attorney General. 4 of my colleagues, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So to be fair, big dogs, okay? 4 big states announced a deal at $18 billion with the distributors. Trouble is, they hadn't checked with the rest of us. So we got a conference call that afternoon. This is pre-Zoom. We got on a conference call, and all hell broke loose. We said, how dare you cut a deal without us? And ultimately, I led the dissenters. I don't know how I got that job as a freshman, but I led the dissenters. And it culminated in a meeting in federal court. I'd been summoned to federal court in Cleveland to a meeting by the federal judge supervising all opioid cases with the 3 CEOs of AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal, and McKesson. And I had 10 AG colleagues with me, and at some point, the judge says, okay, one of you guys has to get up and explain to these CEOs why they have to pay more money than $18 billion. And Attorney General Stein of North Carolina said, this is your fight, Tong, you better get up. So I get up and I tell these 3 guys who are extraordinarily powerful pharmaceutical executives why they have to pay tens of billions of dollars more. And the CEO of AmerisourceBergen looks me in the eye, and he had this haughty air about him. He's an Englishman. And he said, 18 billion is more than enough. I'm not paying a penny more. And I will tell you, in that moment, truth is, I was out of moves. And I was like, okay, I'll see you in court. And I went home. And that's when the states aligned with me. Were like, William, what are we gonna do now, right? What can you do? So fast forward, a few weeks later, he's on an open earnings call with Wall Street. Okay, everybody knows what that is, right? The CEO gets on a call with journalists and analysts, and they ask him questions. And they said, well, Mr. CEO, what about this $18 billion deal with the states? Isn't that, gonna be a real drag on your performance? In the same haughty way, he says, no, it's not a big deal. I can pay it out of cash. I don't even have to reserve for it. There's a transcript for that. And so I got the transcript. I emailed it to all of my fellow AG colleagues, and I said, they're laughing at us. And that's how 18 billion, we added Johnson & Johnson, became 26 billion. All told, since I've become Attorney General, we've recovered more than $50 billion from the opioid and addiction industry. Most of that money will go to treatment and prevention and addiction science, including to programs here in Westport and in Fairfield County, because, by the way, yes, it happens in Westport, right? And in the opioid world, Connecticut is a small, hard-hit state. Let me talk about Purdue quickly. People ask me, what does it mean to you, William, that Purdue Pharma is based in Stamford, Connecticut, your hometown? And frankly, I knew some of the Sacklers and many of the now notorious executives that you read about, because they were in Fairfield County giving money out as philanthropists, and we loved it, right? I mean, there are things all over Connecticut that had, Sackler name or Sackler contributions attached to it. So when I'm asked that question, I think people expect me to make sort of a Homer statement, these are good people, there are a lot of good people working there, this is an important company in Connecticut. And I think I surprise them when I say, I think it means that I have a special obligation and responsibility to be aggressive. And so we were. And so the Sacklers tried to cut a deal with the states at $3 billion. By the way, I can talk more about this in Q&A. It's complicated, probably only interesting to lawyers, but they tried to, because the Sacklers are not bankrupt, right? Let's just be clear about that. The company claimed to be bankrupt, but the Sacklers are nowhere near bankrupt. They're fabulously, fabulously wealthy, and they will always be. And so they tried to contort the bankruptcy process of Purdue Pharma's bankruptcy to settle for $3 billion and get a release for themselves. Again, predictably, I said no with a group of states. Then they said, how about $4.5 billion? And that's when, people got a little tight and it was white knuckle time. And I was at that time leading half the states who were a no on $3 billion. At $4.5 billion, almost everyone abandoned us. And their argument was, William, $4.5 billion is a lot of money, and you can push this too far and overplay your hand. And a lot of Connecticut victims and survivors were starting to feel the same way. And I was hearing from victims and survivors saying, William, you've pushed it pretty far, enough, right? We need this money. But what I said to them is, it's not just about the money, right? It's about justice. It's about accountability. And I said, no Sackler will have to sell a house or a boat or a piece of jewelry or a piece of art, while thousands of people in Connecticut will die every single year. And this is not going to end. As long as I'm Attorney General or in public service, we will be fighting the opioid and addiction crisis. And I said, let me also put it in perspective. At $4.5 billion, they're gonna pay roughly less than $500 million over 9 years, and they'll get a full release and they can walk away. Well, if you assume that they took, which is what's been disclosed in the documents, they took $11 billion out of the company. If you assume that number is right, It's probably a lot bigger than that. But if it's $11 billion and they're paying $450 million, they're gonna pay roughly 5% on their money for 9 years, and they're done. I pay 5% on my car payment, right? And so that's why we kept pushing, and ultimately it was just 9 of us, 8 states and the District of Columbia. And the bankruptcy court tried to cram $4.5 billion down our throats in what's colloquially known as a cram down. We took them to court and we won. And the bankruptcy plan was thrown out and the Sacklers had to come back to the table. And that's how $3 billion became $4.5 billion, which became $6 billion. And that's when I said, okay, $6 billion, but you have to issue a fresh apology. You have to turn over all these documents, and you have to come to court and listen to the families tell you how you've ruined their lives. And they did that. So nothing I can do will ever make it right for Mike Taylor's family. No amount of money will ever make it right. But we pushed as hard as we could to hold these people accountable. So that work continues, and the money is already flowing from the various defendants. And by the way, it's not just Purdue and the Sacklers or the distributors. It's Johnson & Johnson, it's CVS, it's Walgreens, it's Teva. It's a lot of companies, household names that we do know. That is in my role as I'm exercising my consumer protection authority there, but on a larger scale. And I'm doing it on a multi-state basis. And as I said before, it was the big tobacco case that brought the states together to do that really meaningfully the first time. We've done it many times since then. The most recent thing we did was last Tuesday, I sued Amazon. By the way, Prime still works. I didn't mess with that. I know, because I'll probably order something tonight when I get home. So why sue Amazon? Amazon's built this amazing, the most efficient, most far-reaching, most satisfying, consumer products, retail business ever in history. And that's great. I love getting a screwdriver the next day in my mailbox and, think that I have gotten the best price on it because it feels like I have. Trouble is, they are dominant and have become dominant because they're so successful at leveraging their technology and their platform. And what they're now doing, which is what all big companies do, they're now using that technology to prejudice and crush and kill their competitors, right? To shut all of them out. And then the sellers and on their platform, they're now punishing those sellers if they don't play by Amazon's rules. We estimate that we pay as much as a 50% Amazon tax because of all the fees and requirements they put on their sellers. And ultimately, we know what's gonna happen. When Amazon kills everybody else, even though the prices feel low now, but when we have no choice and it's just them, and it's getting close to that point, by the way, those prices are gonna go up, right? And we're not gonna have any choice. And that's not to say that Amazon isn't great. I love Amazon, right? I use Amazon frequently, as do many people. But the idea that they're not dominant and that they don't exercise monopoly power is laughable. I'll give you an example. The general counsel of Amazon came to speak to a bunch of attorneys general to try to convince us not to sue them. And he said, we're not a monopoly. We don't have the market power you think we have. We only have 3-4% of global retail. The lawyers in the room, we heard what he said. Yeah, 3-4% of the whole world, you mean? Okay, who is even close to that? Nobody, right? And they didn't give us the US number. So we have to hold Amazon accountable and get them to play by the rules. And yes, this is a bit of a Standard Oil, big railroad moment. Because they're just that dominant, and Google is just that dominant. We've sued Google too on antitrust grounds. And what I try to remind people is, my we took on Microsoft 20 years ago. Microsoft, by the way, is still the second most valuable company on earth, a $2.5 trillion market cap, okay? If we hadn't initiated and successfully prosecuted an antitrust case against Microsoft 20 years ago, there would be no Amazon, and there would be no Google, and there'd be no Meta, because they would have bought them and they would have squashed them. And every once in a while, you gotta step in and be the ref, and that's what we're doing with Amazon. So that's my job in 35 minutes. There's a lot more to talk about, but let me open it up to questions. Thank you so much.
For several weeks, I've been waiting to address you.
Oh, over there.
A.G. Tong. If you ever go back into private practice, we all want your number.
Won't be cheap.
You're doing a hell of a job.
Thank you.
Questions from this microphone?
I think they want you at the microphone.
Thanks very much for the presentation.
Sure.
It was excellent. But I have two questions about the opioid crisis.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, why has not the Sackler family's personal wealth been touched at all? I think I know the answer, but you might want to elaborate on that. And secondly, while you were presenting this, I just went into the CDC's statistics on drug overdoses, opioid overdoses, and they've skyrocketed since you've taken the money from these companies.
Yep.
What accounts for that?
Well, they were skyrocketing before I became Attorney General, and they're gonna continue to skyrocket. And the money is just starting to flow this year, and most of it, fully 85% of it, has to go to treatment and prevention and addiction science. There's a criticism of the tobacco settlement that money didn't go to smoking cessation. That's not entirely fair. I won't get into why, but most of this money has to go, by the way, to forward-looking programs, to treatment and prevention programs. But I won't lie to you. I mean, this is an avalanche, and we're a few people trying to hold up our hands against it, against this avalanche or flood or whatever metaphor you want to use. And it's going to be a long time before it gets any better. Well, I will say this about the Sacklers. I thought you were going to ask, why aren't they going to jail? Good question. I'd love to see them go to jail. The trouble is you got to prove a claim against them, as we're seeing now in other cases, beyond a reasonable doubt. And the Sacklers have the best lawyers on earth. Thank you for saying that, whoever it was, but their lawyer's much stronger than me, like Mary Jo White, who is the Sacklers' lawyer, and she's a giant. And there are many layers of liability limitation, from the company, from the fact that they were directors, and there's so many layers that they've used to protect themselves that it's very hard to prosecute them criminally, and it's very hard to get at their personal assets. I think you know that that's the answer to the question. However, the $6 billion essentially comes from them. And it is their personal money. It's the money they put into the bankruptcy of the company to buy themselves the release. And so, but we all know that $6 billion for them, sure, that's a lot of money, but they've got much more hidden offshore. And the Attorney General of Connecticut has a hard time getting to the Jersey Islands to access those accounts.
Yes, the Supreme Court has just started its session again this morning. Obviously, there have been some very controversial decisions. There's no particular sign that they're going to moderate their views. There are ethical issues. Yeah. We've all read about them in the paper. Yeah. Connecticut, as of Sunday, has a very tough and good gun law. To what extent do you feel that attorneys general, including yourself, will be able to, I guess the word is, defy the worst decisions by this Supreme Court? The gun law will be challenged. There may be the mifepristone decision. is likely to come down this term. At what point can state attorneys general, in a sense, say to the court, you have lost all legitimacy and we're not going to accept it?
First of all, we're in all of these cases. And so every case that you mentioned, Bruin, Dobbs, the Mifepristone case, West Virginia, 303 Creative, all these cases, Connecticut is in every one of these cases, usually with a coalition of other states. And the court cares very much what the states think. The most dramatic example of that was in December of 2020. I was at Stu's down the street. I was in the parking lot because we didn't have a Christmas tree. And we were late, and all the good ones were gone. And I got a call on my phone, and it was the Deputy Attorney General, and she said, where are you? I said, I'm at Stu's on a Friday night in December getting a Christmas tree. She said, you have to go back home and get on your computer. I said, why? She said, you gotta go back to work. I said, okay, Peg, but what's going on? And she said, 18 Republican attorneys general, led by Ken Paxton of Texas, have gone to the US Supreme Court seeking to overturn the results of the presidential election. You gotta go back to work. So I did. Put a Christmas tree on top of my car and I went back to work. And the country held together in that moment. The Supreme Court did the right thing, didn't hear the case. And yes, I hear you, but our institutions held. And I think in that moment, the justices did the right thing, and we were able to beat back what was an existential threat to our existence as a people and as a nation. Since then, it's gotten really bad, and I will say this: I am not going to defy an order of the U.S. Supreme Court, because I've sworn an oath and a duty to uphold the Constitution. And when I stop doing what federal courts order me to do, that's called a constitutional crisis. And that is part of the disintegration of the Republic. People don't like to hear that. That's just how I feel about it, and I think that's my solemn duty. However, we fight tooth and nail in those cases, and I think we're gonna win. There's two challenges pending before me, before federal district courts in Connecticut, challenging our state's assault weapons ban and our large capacity magazine ban. We've beat preliminary injunction motions in both of those cases already. Now, I recognize that these are, Connecticut federal judges, but we feel very confident that even under the Bruin test, that Connecticut's gun laws are eminently constitutional and that we're gonna win those cases. But I can't guarantee that's the case, but we're gonna fight. I'm in the Mifepristone case. You may know, does everybody know what the Mifepristone case is? So Mifepristone is a drug you take. It's one of two drugs you take for a medication abortion. Okay, medication abortions are half of the abortions in this country today. And Mifepristone has been used safely for 20 years by thousands of Connecticut women and millions of American women. And a group of extremists went into federal court in Texas seeking to get just the right federal judge to say, to ban Mifepristone, essentially, and say that the FDA didn't properly approve Mifepristone. Many of us on the other side of the issue said, we're done playing defense on this issue. So we filed our own lawsuit in federal court in Washington State, and we have a court order that says Mifepristone was properly approved. And because of that, we won, and Mifepristone is now safe, legal, and accessible tonight in our 18 states. However, this is gonna go up to the Supreme Court, and we'll see. In a small glimmer of hope, the Supreme Court had a chance to take that case right away, and they didn't. So I don't know, right? I don't know where we are in terms of this court post-Dobbs and where the court is. The court institutionally is under a tremendous amount of pressure. I think some of them care, and feel it, including Chief Justice. But we'll see. But we're fighting tooth and nail every step of the way.
Hi, I wanted to know how, I guess, slash why a college would be designated as a for-profit college, as opposed to a nonprofit college.
Good question. These are schools that affirmatively make money for their shareholders. Whereas, the reason why I pause when I answer that question is because there's an argument that big institutions and universities are nothing if not for profit. I won't indulge in that academic exercise, except to say that the University of Connecticut and Yale University are not for profit in that nobody pockets money. Nobody as a shareholder or investor gets money based on the performance of that school. And that's why there's a number of, the Connecticut Broadcasting School and again, most of our beauty and cosmetology schools, the person who cuts my hair is sitting right there, so I gotta be careful. I'm gonna see her on Saturday. And so these are schools that make money, basically. They're businesses.
Well, shame on the Sacklers. So they've lowered the life expectancy of Americans by like 1.5 years.
Yes.
It's pretty horrible. And thank you for fighting them. So my question really is about the way that your job interacts with monopolies within the state. So we have a handful of monopolies that are responsible for delivering energy services and a variety of other services, telecommunications.
Healthcare, energy.
Yep. So, and I'm curious as to how the AG oversees that relationship with monopolies that have a tremendous amount of power, and I'd just like to get a better sense for that.
Good. That's the next talk for another 2 hours, but let me try to do it quickly. 3 huge monopolies, maybe even 4, but Eversource, United Illuminating, right? The electric distribution companies, or EDCs, hospitals, right? And increasingly, there's 2, Hartford Healthcare and Yale New Haven. It's a little different for us down here, but that's the rest of the state. Those are huge institutions that are essentially monopolies. The cable companies, airlines, okay? With respect to the cable companies and airlines, why can't I take down Altice? They're so terrible. Because they're very well protected under federal law. We've been preempted. The same is true about the airlines. When I complain to American Airlines, sometimes I get some satisfaction. Oftentimes I get, you can't touch us, okay? So that's part of the answer. With respect to hospitals, that's complicated. Again, there's a good deal of federal preemption. The fact that they're nonprofits plays a role, and that they're tied to educational institutions plays a role, but there's increasing scrutiny of hospitals and hospital and healthcare monopolies, and in particular, private investors and private equity in hospitals. If you don't know, read up on Waterbury Hospital and ECHN. These are 2 hospitals that are in meltdown because a company called Prospect bought them and looted them, and now wants to toss them to Yale New Haven and walk away with $1 gazillion, and it's a really bad situation. Finally, the one that everybody cares about is Eversource and United Illuminating. So I should add health insurers, but that's more monopsony than monopoly, but again, that's for the next talk. But I am in an adversarial posture vis-a-vis Eversource and United Illuminating every single day. So I have a unit in my office that advocates for all of us. In the electricity world, the utility world, we're ratepayers because we pay the rates. And rates are set by the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA. Every state has a utilities regulator of different names. And in most states, the AG is on the other side and is fighting them every time they come in to ask for more money. And so recently, you may know, United Illuminating, which isn't here, but United Illuminating, which has about a third of the state, came in for a huge rate increase of more than $136 million. We fought them hard, and they only got 6, okay? They're freaking out, by the way, and they're threatening us. They're saying Wall Street won't invest in us, and we're not gonna invest in Connecticut, and we'll take our money elsewhere, which is also what's wrong with monopolies. We're at their mercy. Eversource has become a huge regional conglomerate, and it's no longer Connecticut Light and Power. They're basically run out of Boston. They took a big hit when they're now buying water companies and water systems because that's where the money is. And so they took a big hit like United Illuminating did on their Aquarian rate increase. And so they're freaking out too about that. But I won't lie to you, it's, the numbers keep going up and we fight, and maybe we're able to keep the increases lower than they would otherwise be or what they want, but the numbers keep going up. The reason for that is, very quickly, is that, because people always ask me, why is it this way? Because we as a state deregulated 20 years ago. We thought it was a good idea because we thought we could introduce competition in the marketplace, right? And conceptually, that sounded good. And what we said to the utilities was, you have to sell all of your generation assets. You can't be in the power-making business anymore, and they're not. You can only be in the distribution business, which is why on your bill, there's 2 numbers. There's the fuel charge and the distribution charge. What does that mean? That means Eversource owns the poles and wires, and they charge a fee to use the poles and wires. The trouble with it is, there's only one set of poles and wires, and people often say, well, why can't we just bury them in the ground? Because you can't. We live in New England. Like, you can't get through the ledge and historic preservation and all the reasons why we're not Arizona, okay? But there's one set of poles and wires, and until somebody else figures out a different system, logistically, there has to be one player that owns all those poles and wires. And we could take over that, but then who's gonna take over the poles and wires? I don't think anybody in this room wants the government to do that, right? And so we're in a really tough place. There are proposals to let the utilities buy generation again. So they're not, why did prices spike last year? Because we're beholden to natural gas and because of the war in Ukraine. And Eversource has to go out and buy natural gas because they're not allowed to, source their own natural gas and generate natural gas in the way that they were before. So they have to go out and buy it at retail, and it gets passed on to us, and we get shellacked. So there's no easy answer out of this problem. We fight them every single day in terms of their rates. Can we? We could, but then what would have to happen is somebody would have to buy those poles and wires because you can't build another set of poles and wires. And then what do you pay for them? Who's willing to pay for it? Who invests in that? And I guarantee you in that conversation, whatever private sector entity stepped up to say, we'll do that, they're gonna ask us to pay a big piece of the freight, And there's no free lunch, I guess. In that discussion, it's really difficult. Thank you.
Hi, sorry for another economic question.
Yeah.
You were talking about monopolies earlier, specifically Amazon. I was wondering, so how do we know that these giant global MNEs, multinational enterprises, are gonna gouge the consumer versus gouging the supplier, increasing their margin that way? And if they do, for example, just gouge the supplier while maintaining price for the consumer relatively the same, would you still pursue them in the same way?
Good question. I don't know. I think we do the best we can through litigation and get them to tell us as much of the truth as we can get them to tell and produce as many documents as we can get them to produce and to show the rest of the world what they're doing. Let me also be really transparent. I've spent an hour talking about how great we are in the Office of the Attorney General. Litigation is not a good way to set policy and solve problems. It's just not. It would be much better if a bunch of thoughtful legislators got together in Congress and said, here's this problem, let's figure it out. How about AI, guys? Right? It's like way past midnight for them to try to figure out what we're gonna do about AI, but you see what's happening. And so, unfortunately, mine is the crude instrument that we have in place, and it takes years, right, for me and a team of lawyers to go after, companies and people like the Sacklers who are represented by the biggest and baddest and most expensive law firms on earth. It's not a good way to run a railroad, no pun intended. Yes, sir.
William, I have a question for you. 96% of people's assets are held in their homes. What's the state of Connecticut, your Attorney General's office, doing against predatory lending by the banks? And I mean, it's not only predatory lending by the banks, but it's law firms representing frivolous lawsuits. This lady in front of you, they're going to take her home in just a week or less. And she never signed a mortgage. She never has a promissory notice whited out. Now, how can that possibly be going on? We were supposed to be a Constitution state. Is this the Constitution that is being represented? She did go to your Attorney General's office 7 times and gets nowhere there. So I'd like to find out when we can get an answer, because it's everybody supposed to have a Constitution if there is one.
Thank you for that question. And I'm very sorry for what you're going through. And if you've come to our office and you haven't received at least the attention and the review of, and I'd be happy to take it, sir, tonight. A lot of people are hurt in the financial crisis. And a lot of people, by the way, are hurt every day still. And you saw me take on M&T Bank when they totally blew their conversion with People's Bank. By the way, you want to talk about an industry that's well represented and protected in Washington? It's the banks. And I understand.
JP Morgan shouldn't have $66 trillion in assets.
But they do.
And
But they do, and through their efforts over many generations have done a really good job of protecting themselves. And I wish I could have done more against M&T Bank. I did as much as my powers would allow. And during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, Attorney General Jepsen led the way in the National Mortgage Servicer Settlement. I'm taking on Navient, the biggest student loan lender on earth. I wish I could fix these problems tomorrow for people like you and for Connecticut residents. We'd be happy to look at all that information again. I can only do as much as I can do. I'll take the last 3 since you guys have been waiting. We'll do them quick though.
Okay, what about
I get home for dinner.
Yeah. What about the doctors that overprescribe oxycodone and opioids? I mean, I went to the dentist, had a tooth extracted, and on the way out, they handed me 3 oxycodones.
Yeah. So we have all of them in our sites. And as I said before, we're taking down one bad actor at a time. And this is not just Purdue Pharma and the manufacturers, it's distributors, it's the pharmacies, the retailers, and healthcare providers. And working with the feds, we're trying to hold all of them accountable. Once you get down to individual doctors, it becomes a matter of, finding them and resources and picking them off one by one becomes administratively very difficult to do. But no doubt there are many doctors who are responsible. I should also say, though, that many doctors were working in a system that they did not design. This is not to absolve them. But one of the really successful things that the Sacklers were able to do was convince the American healthcare system to measure pain. So when I was a kid, nobody did that. You didn't go to the hospital and they didn't ask you, how do you feel, right? There was not one of the vitals that they took, right? And then At some point in the last 20 years, maybe a little bit longer, especially on a post-operative basis, the doctor would ask you, how do you feel? How much pain are you experiencing on a scale of 1 to 10? That's the Sacklers. And it was designed, right, to sell pills. Well, I feel terrible. Okay, here you go. Here's 30 pills.
Thank you very much for your talk. A quick question. $6 billion came from the Sacklers.
6 billion.
6 billion. How much came to Connecticut?
We're going to get from the Sacklers roughly $100 million.
And the other 5 million? 5
billion. It gets distributed among the other states, and some of that money goes to victims and survivors. So unlike other cases where the states recover all of the proceeds, because this is in a bankruptcy, there are individual claimants, meaning people that have lost loved ones to the opioid and addiction crisis, and they will get paid too. Let me just explain why. Of the 50 billion, we're getting 600 million. Why? Because New York and California aren't going to take the same amount as we are. And so when you split it up 56 ways, states, territories, and the district, and you do the math based on, there are 4 major metrics in opioids. I think it's number of pills, number of deaths, number of people with opioid use disorder, and population. So once you crunch all those numbers, that's what we get. We actually get more than we should under the formula because we've led, and so we get a little bump for that. But once it all shakes out, it's $600 million.
Attorney General Tong,
Yes.
I want to make sure you get home for dinner tonight on time, so I'm not asking a question. I just want to thank you on behalf of the Wise Men,
Thank you.
the Library of Westport, and the town of Westport citizens.
Thank you.